So often, when thinking of the many instances of God's deliverance of his people, we focus on the grand, biblical, miraculous moments. The moment when he sets his people free from their oppressors, from their trials, from their suffering, from their pain, from sin and death. Before these moments of deliverance, there's a period of waiting. When people are stuck with their fear, their affliction, and their bondage, and all they have to rely on is the promise that God will deliver them. Dwelling on these passages where deliverance has not yet been fulfilled can be uncomfortable. Without God's promises, the natural response to such circumstances is just despair. In such times, faith in his promises is tested, doubts arise, and the waiting period grows ever longer. The nation of Israel themselves needed constant reminding of their slavery, to not return to their place of bondage, and not to treat those under their power with the same oppression. While we remember that Moses, as being one through God, delivers Israel from their slavery, this deliverance did not happen overnight. After Pharaoh ordered the Hebrew infant boys to be thrown in the Nile, Moses is the only one who is delivered. It is only 40 years later that he even tries to defy Egypt's control over his people on his own terms, killing an Egyptian who beat a fellow Hebrew man. And his actions only amount to Moses fleeing Egypt and living in Midian for another 40 years. And all this time, over 80 years, Israel's children continue to live under oppression, beaten and enslaved. In Exodus chapter 2, verse 23, we read, "During those many days, after the king of Egypt died, the people of Israel groaned because of the slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham and with Isaac and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew." Well, I won't get too deep into this topic about why God allows suffering. It's important to remember that he heard, he remembered, he saw, he knew. He's not apathetic to the suffering of his people. He's deeply moved by their suffering. While God does reveal himself to Moses, he does so in the burning bush, which while on fire is not consumed by the flames. In this we see a reflection of his people. Even in their suffering, they were preserved, not forgotten. We go back in Genesis a few centuries to Joseph, who also awaited his return to the promised land. At the end of his life, he requests his bones be buried in Canaan. While he was sold into slavery by his brothers, he briefly rose to be in charge of Potiphar's house, only again to be thrown in prison. And even when he interprets the dream of the cupbearer, who is then set free, the cupbearer forgets about him. And Joseph continues in the waiting in the pit for 2 years before he is delivered. In these times of suffering, God is still with him. Sometimes the response for times of waiting is simply to have patience, waiting for the deliverance that God will bring. You turn to Romans chapter 8, we read starting in verse 22. "For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. And not only the creation, but we ourselves, who are the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies. For in this hope we're saved. Now hope that is seen is not hope. For who hopes in what he sees? But if we have hope in what we do not see, we wait for it with patience." Sometimes, as in the case of Esther, there's an opportunity to speak up on behalf of those who are oppressed, not to be overzealous, thinking that we have the power in ourselves to save, but doing what we are able, and with fasting and prayer, we can stand up for those who are oppressed. As Mordecai says in Esther chapter 4, "For you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you not come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" We see also in Acts chapter 12 that when Peter is imprisoned, as the church is worried for his life, waiting for his deliverance, they gather together in prayer, not knowing that his deliverance is already accomplished. And in these times of trial and anticipation, we see again and again the Israelites enslaved in Egypt, to the people of Judah threatened with destruction, to the Jews in exile with death sentence looming over them, to the apostles beaten and imprisoned, and their distressed brothers and sisters in the church. They were all in prayer, crying out to God, fasting, worshiping, humbling themselves before him, fixing their attention on him. As Jehoshaphat plays, "We are powerless against this great horde that is coming against us. We do not know what to do, but our eyes are on you." Or as we read in Hebrews 11 this morning of Moses, "By faith he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king, for he endured, seeing him who is invisible." Throughout that chapter, we read of the people who held to the faith in the promises of God, no matter how dire their circumstances. We read, some were tortured, refusing to accept release, that they may rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and flogging, even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were killed with a sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering in the deserts and the mountains, in the dens and the caves of the earth. And all these, though commended for their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us, they should not be made perfect. They knew they were not in control of their circumstances, and yet they put their faith fully in God to deliver them. This is ultimately what Jesus did himself in the garden as he was sweating blood alongside his sleeping disciples. He looked to God, praying both, "Let this cup pass," and "Your will be done." So now, as we all deal with our current trials and circumstances, suffering, as we grapple with sin, this is the key: waiting on God's timing, trusting him through our suffering. We may not have all the answers now, but we can put our faith in his plan and purpose, knowing that one day he will bring deliverance.